key part of successful open source projects really is the community. And it's how people come together to share and collaborate and innovate. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about here and we wanted to learn from is about how this works in the real world and hear from at least a thought leader as to how does this work. And free and open source software has come a long way since it has started a few decades ago. Today, it's the default choice for just about every project. There's open source parts of them going on from tech giants and large organizations like Amazon, Apple, and Google. Organizations everywhere are contributing to open source, and open source is a key part of what's happening. And so with that, I'm really excited to introduce Vicky Brasseur, who is the author of Forge Your Future with Open Source. She's a corporate strategist, an open source and technical leader. She's an author and a speaker, and she's going to share insight about the freedoms of open source and how it works and how to be part of an open source community. Vicky?
Hey there, everyone. Thanks for coming to GitLab Commit, around the world 24/7. Pretty exciting stuff. So I'm going to start with 3 assumptions of you, my beautiful audience. Number 1, you believe in free software and open source. I mean, considering you're here at an event for a major open source project and company, one would assume that you believe in the importance and the power of free and open source software to some extent. My second assumption is that you want to see more free and open source software in the world. And by being here and by being a part of the GitLab community, you want to put your knowledge into action by creating and releasing more free and open source software. And my third assumption is that you know what free and open source software is. And actually, I find that it's more and more, it's not safe to make this assumption. This turns out to be knowledge that we have to revisit, refresh, because as we go out there in this wide software world of ours, we find a lot of people are working under different definitions of free software and especially of open source software. A lot of these come across more as hearsay than truth, like that definition has been acquired via the telephone game. They heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it. And at each step in the process, the definition is modified just slightly. So when it reaches them, it's not the true definition. It is more important than ever, I believe, for us all to be using the exact same terms to mean these things. Because important things are worth repeating, here's your quick refresher, because again, this is not a good assumption to make. We'll start with the 4 freedoms. Now, what you see on this screen here are the 4 freedoms as defined and defended by the Free Software Foundation and anyone who believes in free software. For this slide and for several other slides throughout the presentation, I will either read or summarize the content for the visually impaired. So for this one, we have the 4 freedoms. They are 0 indexed. So freedom 0 is the freedom to run the software. Freedom 1 is study, 2, redistribute, and 3 is improve the software. Now, I suspect everyone here is at least mildly familiar with these freedoms, but what I've learned is that fewer people out in the world are familiar with these. What you see here is the open source definition. It's maintained by the Open Source Initiative, and it's accepted around the world as the single canonical definition of open source. It's built upon the 4 freedoms that we had on the previous slide, and also the Debian Free Software Guidelines. The OSD, as we call it, the open source definition, it details what is required of any software that calls itself open source. There are 10 items on the list. Number 1 is free redistribution, 2 is source code, 3, derived works, 4, integrity of the author's source code, 5, no discrimination against persons or groups, 6, no discrimination against fields of endeavor, 7, distribution of license, 8, the license must not be specific to a product, 9, the license must not restrict other software, and 10, the license must be technology neutral. Software that does not provide for each and every one of these 10 items, none of them are optional. Software that doesn't provide for all 10 is literally by definition not open source because it violates the open source definition. Now you can ensure that the software that you are using or that you release provides these freedoms and these benefits by making sure that it uses an open source initiative approved license. Software that uses a different license can't be guaranteed to ensure these freedoms. Now, everyone in this lovely worldwide audience now hopefully agrees that the 4 freedoms and the open source definition, these are very good things. And they are things that deserve to be more widely adopted, more widely used. We all hopefully feel this way, and therefore we share a mission to increase free and open source software adoption across the world. And despite that, though, as an overall movement, we keep accepting things that work against our purpose. It's not doing us any favors. Now, I have a series of 2 stories that I'm going to be sharing on the screen. And again, I will read them for the visually impaired. So the first in this section of stories is, I no longer use or contribute to a project because the principal maintainer is notoriously abrasive. Unfortunately, it's typical for projects to be horrible to their contributors. Next story, I submitted patches, but they were rejected without feedback. Now, what I'm sharing are just a few of the stories that people have shared with me about their experiences trying to participate in a variety of free and open source software communities. Next story. They said it was a meritocracy, but they wouldn't even tell anyone what it took to get to land a patch. How can I get to be good enough if you don't even tell me what that looks like? I'm not a fucking mind reader. Now, I wish I could say these stories are outliers, but the majority of stories that people shared with me are along these lines. And the final story in this batch, I asked them to use my correct name. Then they spent the next several dozen mailing list messages debating whether my asking that was rude. But it's my name. Now, the sad truth is that nearly everyone in free and open source software has either heard or experienced stories just like these. As badly as projects have been known to treat their contributors, as we've just seen, even more projects are downright hostile to the people who simply want to use the software in their day-to-day life. Now for the second batch of stories. Starting with this one, there were no docs for how to use it, and they told me just to read the code. Now, it's safe to say that the user experience of many pieces of free and open source software is optimized not for the user, but rather for the developers. And in many cases, it's optimized simply for the founder of the project, rather than the people who are going to use it at the end. The next story. I tried to use this software, but I couldn't figure out the UI. It was like they just made stuff up and slapped it together. Nothing made sense. This developer-centric perspective often leads to a disparate mishmash of user interface paradigms and an abundance of user confusion. Next story in this batch. I wanted to use the open source option, but it doesn't even do the basic stuff well. This by developers for developers mindset can limit the number of people who can reasonably use our software. What makes sense to a developer may not make sense to everyone else. Heck, sometimes it doesn't even make sense to other developers. And the final story in this batch. I asked about Windows support. Then they mocked and bullied me. By limiting our support only to software running on free systems, we have similarly limited the number of people who might use and eventually support free software. Now, all of these stories, they point to areas where we can do a better job bringing others in to the free and open source software fold. And I know what you're thinking. No, not all free open source projects or people are like this. Some of them do an amazing job bringing on new contributors or in doing their documentation or in usability, but enough projects are this bad. And it has been happening for so long that it's given our entire movement a bad reputation, that therefore all free and open source software participants have a place to work to improve. After all, improve is right there as one of the 4 freedoms: run, study, redistribute, improve. So we should apply it to our own movement as well as to our software. This freedom to improve, among the others in the 4 freedoms in the open source definition, are more important today than ever. And they're worth sharing and they're worth spreading. But by turning a blind eye to discrimination, to unkindness, and to poor usability in our products, and in the projects that we ourselves use, by tolerating user hostile software, we, each and every one of us, are guilty of holding back free and open source software from meeting its full potential. But it's okay, because we, each and every one of us, are also perfectly positioned to do something about it. We, each and every one of us, can help lift up free and open source software to its full potential. And where we need to start is by recognizing that free and open source software is carrying a ton of privilege baggage. It is a privilege to have the free time to learn to contribute to free and open source software, to learn how to program, or the resources to afford to go to university to learn how to program, or the resources to take a year off of work to go to a boot camp to learn how to program. Many people don't have that time or those resources. But without programming knowledge, it's impossible to use a lot of free and open source software, let alone contribute. It is a privilege to be able to make the choice to use free software. Many people are not in a position to dictate what software they use to make their living. They need to feed their families. And so they will use what their employer tells them to use. Now, as a movement, we all need to just stop, press pause, step back, and look at the perspective of people who are not us, people who are not free and open source software users, whatever their reason may be for not using it. What is that? What is their perspective? We need to acknowledge the privilege that we have to make that choice, to use free and open source software, and then think about how we can share that privilege with others. Everyone lately is saying open source has won, free software and open source software has won. But free and open source software will never win unless all people are able to experience the freedoms that it promises. So where do we start? It's actually surprisingly easy and quite simple. There are obviously many things that we could do. I mean, we could, for increasing this understanding and adoption of free software outside of our little bubble, because we do mostly live in a little bubble, and how we can spread that to those who don't know it yet. So there's lots of ways you could start. But if you need somewhere just to focus on, then I recommend these things: applicability, usability, inclusivity, and humility. 4 little words. Now those 4 words are all well and good, but what do I mean by them? Well, I'll get into that a bit more in a moment, but I want to remind everyone of the context of those 4 words. That context is this: the goal is to increase free and open source usage and adoption. Yes, again, there are lots of other things we could do. We could focus on contributions, make it easier for people to contribute to the software, or we could focus on increasing adoption and use in, for instance, governments, or any number of things. There's lots of stuff we could do. I mean, for instance, in my professional life, I focus on the business side of things and how companies can use, release, and contribute to free and open source software in ways that are both good for their bottom line and also for the communities. But as a greater community of free and open source software citizens, I believe that this is where we have the best chance to make the biggest splash, by bringing free and open source software to the broader population. In doing so, we will be laying a foundation for some of those other areas of focus, like contributions, like use in governments, or what have you. Now, the goal: increase free and open source software usage and adoption. We must keep our eye on that. Keeping that in mind, let's go back to those 4 words and those explanations. Starting with applicability. How can we make free and open source software applicable to more people? Right now, many, but again, no, not all, but many projects are built by FOSS developers for FOSS developers. And that's gotten us really far so far. Don't get me wrong, but now it's time to branch out in earnest. So what do those non-developers, what do those non-techies, what do they need in their software? If we can target those less technical users, the people less like us, your cousin, your brother, your marketing liaison, your neighbor, the man who delivers your pizza, the woman who remodels your home, right? We can target them. I think we're going to be in a much better position as free and open source software communities. I mean, these people may potentially sympathize with the philosophies of free and open source software, but their primary concern is that they have problems to solve, and they need software that will solve those problems. So if we take the time to learn how they communicate and listen to what problems they are trying to solve, we can then build solutions for that. And this, frankly, this is how you win hearts and minds with any product, free and open source software or otherwise, by addressing people's problems. So focus on that problem solving first. and then the dogma, the philosophy, the mission of free and open source software second. Now this brings us to our second little word, and that is usability. As you are solving these problems, try to do so in a way that makes sense to those less technical users. For starters, you could recruit some user interface and user experience designers and testers, some accessibility designers and testers. These people are out there. They want to help. All you need to do is ask. Now, this is an organization that can do a lot of great stuff for you. It's open source design. You can find them at opensourcedesign.net. It's a great place to start. These are designers who understand free and open source software. They want to help improve it. So reach out to them. Go to their discourse, post something, and start that dialogue to help your project become more usable. But if you don't have the time or the cycles to work with a designer, then at least try to apply this principle to your software. That is the principle of least surprise. Now, this means you do what people actually expect, not what you think they ought to expect. So talk to them, see how they operate, see what they expect their software to do, and then do that. Because the more intuitive you can make your project, your software, the more likely people are to actually use it. So use those tried and true UI paradigms instead of reinventing the wheel. Again, we're so good at reinventing wheels. Even if those tried and true UI paradigms are coming from proprietary software, don't infringe upon their intellectual property, but do see how they do it and try to find a way to make your project do it in a similar manner so you can minimize that surprise for your user. Another way to do this and to work on this particular word is to write and maintain accurate user documentation, not necessarily developer documentation. This is a place where a lot of free and open source software projects fall short. And yeah, it is hard. It's really hard to write user docs, and it takes a lot of time. But in software development, the time spent on documentation has far and away the highest return on investment. And that's because it allows users to do things on their own. That gives them this great sense of accomplishment. It's like, yes, I solved my problem all on my own without a programmer to help me. And then they feel well disposed about the project. And if they feel well disposed about the project, then they're more likely not only to continue using it, but also to recommend it to their friends, their family, their colleagues, to help spread that free software to more people. Now we come to our third little word, inclusivity. If we're going to welcome billions of people to our movement, we need to welcome billions of people to our movement. This means understanding and accepting that others have different experiences, different needs, different skills than we do, and then considering those experiences, needs, and skills, and especially putting them before our own. For instance, getting back to documentation, write docs for Windows, write binaries for Windows. Windows is far and away the most used operating system, even among developers. Many surveys show that approximately 50% of all software developers use Windows. And now we have the Windows subsystem for Linux. So that number is just growing. So stop fighting it. Don't argue with people using Windows. Don't shame them for using Windows because they're not using free software. Accept it. Support its users. Build free and open source software projects that work on Windows and are easy for people to use. And what you will have done is flung open the doors for massive adoption of free and open source software. Another thing we can do is embrace codes of conduct. Now, I work with a lot of people who want to be new contributors to free and open source software. Heck, I wrote an entire book about how to contribute to free and open source software. And I hear the same stuff from almost all these new contributors. And that is that free and open source has a horrid reputation. Even projects that are usable and helpful, they get tainted by this horrid reputation. New contributors are petrified of being treated like rubbish. It's so bad that I had to include an entire chapter in my book to teach people how to deal with the bad behavior that's endemic to many free and open source software communities. So let me give you an example of that. So again, I do speak with all those new contributors, but I also get around a lot, and I've been around free and open source software for more than 30 years. So I do speak with a lot of older contributors as well. And if you spend any time in free and open source software lately, you inevitably trip over arguments about using Slack in free and open source software communities. Now, as tools go, Slack has a lot of problems for a lot of reasons, free and open source software related and otherwise, but we're not getting into those right now. But despite all of those potential problems, communities use it instead of the old standard IRC. And when I do speak with those contributors, new and old alike, they all tell me the real reason they don't want to use IRC. It's not that it is this old arcane system. I mean, these are intelligent people. They can figure out arcane systems, and they're okay with using something that's less shiny if it's the right tool. And frankly, we've got things like IRC Cloud now, which make IRC as easy and as useful as Slack. No, that's not it. It's not that it's an arcane system. These people don't come to IRC because it is overflowing with trolls and with assholes. There are a lot of channels that even I won't participate in or simply read. And I love IRC. I'm on IRC 24/7. But I won't waste my time in these channels purely because their communities have allowed trolls and assholes and assholery to flourish. And that, my friends, that is why IRC is losing to Slack. It's not technical, it's social. For better or worse, Slack is a gated community, and IRC is Mordor. So it's not about the technology or the licensing or the freedoms. It's about the experience. So a great way to do this is, again, to have those codes of conduct, enact them, and more importantly, learn to enforce them effectively. Learn to have these difficult conversations. It is a skill. You can learn, you can practice, you can get better at this. And as you're having these difficult conversations and working with people in your community to enforce that code of conduct, understand that ignorance is far, far more common than malice. People are more likely to accidentally offend than to intentionally offend. So adjust communications accordingly, to coach rather than chastise. That said, do institute a no asshole policy. People who refuse to accept the coaching, refuse to learn how to play nicely with others, they must be shown the door. They have to leave. And people who object to things like codes of conduct, they are also free to leave. And no, your project isn't going to suffer very much. It's going to thrive, as will the rest of free and open source software, as it starts to shed this horrible reputation. So therefore, by enacting and enforcing a codes of conduct, you won't simply be helping your project's community, but you'll be helping the reputation of all of free and open source software. And that brings us to our fourth little word, and that is humility. Remember, free and open source software isn't about you, it's about us. So please consider the needs of other people. Consider the impact your software can have on others. Consider the experiences of others, but most importantly, please meet people where they are. Go to them. Stop expecting people who aren't capital T, capital B, true believers to come to understand and use free and open source software all on their own, just because you say they should. People who don't know, who don't understand, and most particularly whose needs are not being met by free and open source software, they will not join the movement. By not going to them, by not meeting people where they are, we are closing the door to most of the software using population of the world. We want to grow the use and adoption of free and open source software. We must meet people where they are. Discover where these people are in their lives and their needs and their reactions and their problems, then go and meet them there, rather than expect them to come to us. And by focusing on these four words, applicability, usability, inclusivity, and humility, through understanding and empathy with others and through a user-focused approach, free and open source software can reach and influence billions. We all, together, we can reach billions. So thank you. I am Brasseur. I'm a corporate strategist and open source leader. I'm also the author of this, the first and only book about how to contribute to free and open source software projects. Its title is Forge Your Future with Open Source. You can find these slides already here on Internet Archive. It's archive.org/details/GitLab commit-4 ways to further FOSS. You can find me here at Twitter at @Brasseur, and the book at the URL fossforge.com. Thank you so much, GitLab, for having me. I very much appreciate it. And thank you all for being here.